Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome to our CoLab Master Series talking about climate change. My name is Megan Lance, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Development here at HIT, and I'm going to be moderating our discussion today. Before we get started, I'm going to start like we do every meeting at HIT with a quick safety moment. My safety moment today is really about safe driving. I know it's been a couple of weeks since we've had daylight savings, and I know I speak for myself that at 5:30, it not only looks like midnight, it feels like midnight. And so I just wanted to share a little bit of a reminder when we are commuting, whether it's to work or to run errands, as we embark on this getting dark earlier. I wanted to share a couple of safety moments as it goes to safe driving. It's actually not paranoia. Driving at night is definitely more dangerous than driving during the day. And I think when you combine the market that we're in right now with a lot of our children and kids in the neighborhood being at home and trying to get outside after a lot of virtual learning, it's important to keep these 5 quick tips in mind. So first, make sure you clean up your view. Make sure your windshield is clean and that there's no cracks, anything that could potentially impede your vision. Be aware of quickly changing light conditions. As you're driving around, especially in that dusk hour, it goes from light to dark very quickly. Make sure you turn your headlights on. If you have the ability to keep them in auto so that they're on as the time changes. Be sure to watch for wildlife on the road. And I think most importantly is slow down. Give yourself the time, the space in between the car in front of you, especially as you're pulling into neighborhoods and areas where there's heavily populated. Just take a couple minutes longer and slow down. All right, so I'm gonna kick over to our presentation now. And I wanted to share a little bit about today's format. We're gonna have a short presentation in the beginning to really level set and talk a little bit about what the definitions of operational and embodied carbon are. As we follow that presentation, I'm gonna moderate a discussion with our panelists. And we're gonna cover a lot of information today. But what I really wanna share with you is that all of the materials, including the recording of the session, is going to be sent and are available to you after the fact. So don't worry as much about capturing everything that's on the screen. Listen, engage with us, ask questions along the way, utilize the Q&A box within the Blue Jeans platform to ask your questions. And then feel free to use the toggle bar down at the bottom to adjust your views between the presenters or the presentation. So as I mentioned, today we're going to tackle a topic with climate change, talking about the differences in operational and embodied carbon. With me today, I'm joined by Isaiah Walston, HIT, our Director of Sustainable Construction, who has a true passion for this topic and has really been the person that has led a considerable effort at HIT to make us carbon neutral by 2023. Joining him, we have Jeff Frost from Brightworks. He's a recognized national subject matter expert on a wide array of material issues affecting the built environment. And he's the co-founder of the National Mindful Materials Collaborative, an industry-led initiative to make it easier for building professionals to select products with health and environment attributes. And we also have Holly Lenehan from Hickok Cole. Holly has over 17 years experience and spearheads the firm's high performance building practice, most recently led the American Geophysical Union designed to operate net zero energy. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined with such an esteemed group of subject matter experts. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to Isaiah to share with us a little bit of an introduction.
Thanks, Megan. So I think any carbon conversation starts with remembering why we're talking about carbon. So this chart and graph is showing the Earth's average temperature over the past 120 years. And what we see is since the 1970s, there's been a dramatic increase in the average temperature of Earth's surface. And this is due to increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This year in May, scientists measured the highest amount of carbon in the atmosphere in modern history. And actually, the last time carbon levels were this high in the atmosphere were 300 million years ago. So that is significant. And we've seen a spike in the past 200 years. Everyone's thinking, May, you know, we were all locked down. Everyone's emissions are lower this year. How can it be so high? Well, these emissions are cumulative. They're adding up. The Earth cannot sequester or capture all of the carbon that human-related activities are producing. So carbon sequestration is recapturing atmospheric carbon. And the only natural way that that happens is through photosynthesis. Now, humans do sequester some carbon with scrubbers on smokestacks. So we capture that carbon and then we pump it deep down in the earth in empty aquifers. And there's also new technologies coming out for carbon sequestration, but none of them are scalable yet to date. So why does that matter? The Earth is getting a little warmer. Well, it's the 2-degree threshold. Scientists predict that if the Earth's average temperature reaches 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, there'll be significant climate change. And that's going to be expressed through sea level rise, more severe storms, droughts and fires, and biodiversity collapse, costing trillions of dollars annually. The EPA predicts that by 2100, so in 80 years, U.S. residential real estate losses will be at $360 billion annually. So this is significant impacts. But enough about the doom and gloom. Let's start talking about tracking and reducing. So there are a multitude of carbon calculators out there. A quick online search will produce a long list, so please go and investigate. HIT utilizes GHG protocol for our calculation methods, but all of them break out carbon emissions into different categories: scope 1, 2, and 3, and direct and indirect emissions. So a direct emission is an emission that's created from something that you own or control. Indirect emissions are all emissions that are a consequence of your operation. So in terms of a company or a manufacturing facility, scope 1 is your buildings that you own and your fleet. Scope 2 is all the purchased gas and electricity you use to heat, cool, light, and operate your spaces. Scope 3 is upstream and downstream activities, supply chain, including employee commuting, business travel, waste generation, and leased assets as some examples. It's also important to note that these calculators are going to track a multitude of greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, but all calculators will provide a carbon dioxide equivalent. So when people are talking about carbon dioxide, or carbon footprint, they're in fact talking about a multitude of greenhouse gases that they've just equated to carbon's global warming. So now that people are tracking their carbon, right, everyone wants to reduce that, to set goals, reduction goals. And so there's some terms flying around that I think we need to identify: carbon neutral and zero carbon. So carbon neutral, you are still producing carbon. So you're trying to actively reduce the amount of carbon that you're creating, and then you're purchasing offsets, carbon offsets, for the remainder of the emissions that you are creating. And that's really investing in renewable energy infrastructure or reforestation. So you're allocating a part of that to your portfolio. Zero carbon means that no carbon emissions are being created or produced from a product or a service. So that zero carbon is really everyone's ultimate goal. So operational carbon in terms of a building, that is all the carbon that is created to actually occupy and utilize that building. So that's employee commuting, energy to light, cool, heat your spaces. Embodied carbon is all the carbon that was created from raw material extraction, manufacturing, shipping, and construction of that building. And if we look at scope 1, 2, and 3 of all of those steps, there are a lot of data points. So it is a big task to track. Combining all of that is that building's total carbon footprint. And although it's not really referenced in this slide, it's important to note that we have to think about the end of life of that building. So deconstruction and demolition of that building also has to be accounted for when you're calculating a total carbon footprint of a building. So this chart, although it is 2 years old, I think it should be in every carbon presentation. Just take a second to explain it here. Operational carbon is in the yellow, or excuse me, embodied carbon is in the yellow, operational is in the blue. So that embodied carbon, that's right off the bat. And then once you occupy that space, the operational carbon starts adding up. So those two combined is your total footprint to date. It's important to note that it takes 15 years for operational carbon to equal embodied carbon for a typical building built in 2020. Now, as we design and build more efficient buildings, to that ultimate goal of net zero energy, that number gets even further out. So as we're driving down operational, it's also important to know we need to start driving down embodied. And we have another slide that we'll reference later on in this discussion to show the actual impact of embodied carbon in the construction industry. It is huge. It's like 40% of Earth's total emissions are in embodied carbon. So this is significant. So how do we start tracking embodied carbon? From a material standpoint, we need to start with the manufacturer. So the manufacturer needs to supply what their carbon footprint of their material is. How is that done? So it starts off with a product category rule, or a PCR. Those are guidelines, ISO standards that kind of set boundaries of what needs to be tracked for a particular product type. So once you have your PCR decided, then you actually conduct a life cycle assessment, or an LCA. And so you're gathering the data, you're crunching the numbers. Once you have that information, then the manufacturer would publicly disclose that in an environmental product declaration, also known as an EPD. And the EPD lists a multitude of environmental impacts that product or material has. The one that we're looking at for embodied carbon is the global warming potential, or the GWP. So that could also be looked at as the carbon footprint. It's also important to note that there are industry-wide EPDs and manufacturer-specific EPDs. So industry associations are creating EPDs for a particular material type, while manufacturers are more specific in an exact material. So to calculate the total embodied carbon of a building, you use your drawings or your design to do takeoffs and multiply that by the material's global warming potential, and that will provide your total embodied carbon. And then at that point, you can start going through and identifying other materials that could be used that have a lower global warming potential. So I know I just threw a lot out there to everybody, but really wanted to kind of set the foundation. Now we'll lean on the industry experts to kind of go in a little more detail.
Great, thank you so much, Isaiah, for that introduction. Certainly helps set the tone. So Jeff, let's kick things off with you. When you're working with clients that are really new to this carbon journey, where do you start? Can you share with us a couple of initial strategies or steps that you typically recommend?
Yeah, thanks, Megan, and thanks, Isaiah, for the presentation. It was a good overview for what we're going to be talking about today. Yeah, I mean, typically it starts with that educational component, right? I think a lot of people have spent the last decade thinking about operational carbon and driving those numbers down. So what we want to do is also kind of, as Isaiah has just done, emphasize the importance and relevance associated with embodied carbon and what kind of footprint that actually has on their projects. I think once people start to see the scale as represented in the slide that's up there now, start to see the scale of the embodied carbon that's out there, we start to have a really deeper discussion about how do we start to address those. Initially, where we want to get them started, if they're just getting kicked off with this, is that there are opportunities for them to start doing this very easily. There's, concrete, steel, and insulation tend to be pretty great places to start and have an early successful win on just about any project, and usually without much cost implication for the project itself. If it's a client that's a little farther along and making more progressive efforts around carbon in general, or has made some 2030 commitments or some goals that they've are starting to drive or align their programs with, and then we'll typically talk to them about where they set their boundaries. What is it that they're measuring, how they're measuring it, and get a little bit more specific about the approaches for that.
Okay, and can you share, just based on your experience, some of the tools that you recommend people utilize or invest in?
Yeah, I like to think that your consultants are great tools. The nice thing is that, or the difficult part is that all of the tools have, some inherent flaws to them. And ultimately, it's about understanding where some of those flaws are in order to be more accurate. If you're just trying to get your kind of toe dipped into this conversation, it's fine to be referencing this kind of somewhat reliable data. And part of that's because we want to see people taking action, and action can still account for 40 or 50% of reducing your embodied carbon by 40 by 50% pretty easily. So even with these kind of imperfect tools, we still have some better method or some big opportunity in front of us. We typically will lean on tools like EC3 and OneClick as kind of our two primary tools that we reference. EC3 is a procurement tool that allows you to do some comparisons, and OneClick for us is a much more kind of deeper grained benchmarking tool that allows you to experiment with alternative construction practices and see how different building approaches might overall reduce the footprint. So different orders of magnitude and scale that are there.
Okay. Can you maybe share a little bit more on the LCA calculation methods for life cycle?
Yeah, so I guess the one thing I would point out is what we want to understand when we're looking at EPD information, things that are kind of directly reported on the itself. It's really important to realize that the difference between one EPD, even within the same product category, one carpet manufacturer against another carpet manufacturer, as an example, while they may be following similar PCRs, product category rules, they could be using different data sets or different methodologies for calculating that information. And so there's an inherent uncertainty associated with those calculations that isn't in the EPD itself, which is why tools like EC3 and OneClick, leveraging these other tools that are adding that uncertainty to it, is a big, I'll say, a big advantage when you're thinking about adding up the embodied carbon. Looking at the EPD is not going to get you the answer, but adding that uncertainty gives you some level of clarity to be able to compare those apples to apples.
Great. And then Holly, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing?
Oh, sure. Along the lines of embodied carbon, one of the things that we're starting to do, many of our clients are coming to us with repositionings, and one client in particular I just spoke to the other day in Arlington, and an existing building, because all of the materials are already in the building, starts way ahead of the game on an LCA, because there's no additional carbon expended to bring that building to market. Not none, but comparatively very little. So what what we're trying to do is create a story now around our projects, and the story, and I mean nonfiction, right? So, but the narrative around these projects are, you know, a mechanism, a means to market them, and so we see that in our region particularly, there's a lot of traction. Most people do in fact want to affect change around the climate, and so if we can talk to our clients about their existing assets and repositioning them, or because I don't think we have one of the charts, but most of the buildings on the planet are already built, so that's one way to really affect change. I will say that for our practice, using life cycle analysis is new. We haven't quite you know, worked it all the way through our process, but it's something we're trying to get better at. And then and as we know, you can't make change unless you measure it, and so that's really important. And LEED is the framework for that. So that's how many of clients come to us. They want to hit a target, and I'm saying now every one of my gold or platinum projects should get an LCA, just because that then informs all of our clients. And then finally, this type of EC3 tool, the product side of things for us, that's it's down this sort of chain of the process. It's at the end, but it's essential. So we're also tracking that. I was so happy. I got a email yesterday with a net zero positive product. So obviously the market is changing, and changing quickly, which is exciting.
Great. Okay, now that we've got a good baseline knowledge, let's dive a little deeper into the embodied carbon side. So Jeff, really to kind of frame our discussion, I know you mentioned it a little bit before, but can we talk a little bit about the impact of embodied carbon as compared to operational, and maybe just reference again what that scale really looks like?
Yeah, so if we want to pull back up that slide, there we go. You know, this gives you a little bit of an idea of how things are starting to change. This is from Architecture 2030. We've seen this slide referenced throughout the years, and industry has largely been segregated into a separate column, and we often kind of perceived this impact of buildings as being a large sliver. What we're starting to see emerging with new information and new data is available is that you know, we're seeing a pretty significant chunk of the pie. I can't see the numbers right now, but I'm going to say, you know, just under 40-some% is associated with embodied carbon. That's the, you know, as we listed there, concrete, steel, aluminum make up a huge component of that. The next part of that down below is industry, which is the production of all the other materials that go into this. So it is a big piece of the pie. And the one thing I'll also mention too, with the slide that's on there is, you know, conventional thinking says, you know, for a building built in 2020, between now and 2050, 49% of its emissions will be embodied carbon, 51% of its emissions will be operational carbon. That starts to tell a big story, especially since we have a cap on how much emissions we can put out between now and 2050. The interesting thing about the operational side, if you go to the next one, operations is being addressed, right? We're constantly lowering those to net zero targets. Codes are starting to get more strict. We're also starting to see an electrification of the grid, right? A greening of the grid that's starting to bring down emissions from grid sources. So operational carbon between now and 2050 is going to significantly reduce as these things become more cleaner. But our embodied carbon, those projects that are being built right now today, the ones that were just put, you know, shovels are going into the ground right now, that emissions from that project are going to exist in our atmosphere between all the way through 2050 and beyond. And so if we're going to start having an impact on embodied carbon, we've got to start doing that today. We've got to start hitting these with every single project.
Great point. Holly, do you want to add kind of where you see the biggest areas of impact are?
Well, certainly in our office for quite some time, we've been very interested in cross-laminated timber. And so I think, and clearly iLab is an example of that, right? That we're taking a hard look again at the type of materials we're using, and finding that there are more benefits than in addition to the embodied carbon question. So that's definitely something that we're doing. And then I'm trying in any way that I can to even talk to my designers about thinking about where they source things from, right? This is sort of, from my perspective, it's a design muscle. We have to think differently. And so, you know, within 500 miles of DC, Virginia Mist might be a beautiful stone that we should be using in lieu of something that comes on a container ship. So it's a process, I think. I think we're sort of looking at it from every angle that we can, trying to make an impact, you know, from the start of design, you know, on through, you know, how the building gets constructed and what it's built of.
Isaiah, I have a question for you. We know that our supply chain decisions are absolutely critical. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we're seeing with that and really some basic considerations as it relates to supply chain?
Yes. And first, I just want to thank everyone who has requested an EPD from a manufacturer for the past few years. Even if you didn't know what an EPD was, you are helping change the market. So a lot of manufacturers are on board in providing this information, but there is a lot more manufacturers and products that do not have this information yet. So there are definitely gaps. When we are looking at embodied carbon calculations, a lot of the data we're looking at is concrete and steel. And that's where we see a lot of actionable reductions immediately just in mixed designs, but it's also important to note that it is jurisdictional. You know, whether that manufacturing facility is part of an electrified grid versus, you know, coal-based. So just where that manufacturing facility is could also impact global warming potential of those products. So there's a lot of different areas at play. Definitely varies by geography. We're seeing a lot more information in California than, let's say, the central United States. So we just have to keep requesting that information. And then when you're actually taking a dive into your project, you know, simple swap out of mixed designs can be very impactful. But as those are extinguished, we have to start rethinking design to those, you know, other types of materials such as mass timber, as Holly mentioned. CoLab, for example, has shown a 37% reduction in embodied carbon with its life cycle analysis.
Great. And Holly, I know you mentioned a little bit about kind of changing the process and the mindset from a design perspective. And you shared a little bit about playing out in building products. Could you maybe share a little more there and maybe talk a little bit to the transparency that you're seeing in the market?
Yeah, I think that again, I mean, I'm just going to echo what Isaiah said. On the product side, I mean, I have just sort of in an interest in self-educating. There's transparency catalogs. There are a lot of different places you can go and try to do this product comparison. We have a new office coming online, and I thought, well, we should be doing exactly what we're talking about. So I did in fact use the EC3 tool to say, hey, we have you know, if we're putting chipboard on our product, we should make sure it has the least carbon footprint. So those are things I think that is the type of thing you have to practice. As I said, I think it's a design muscle. And I mean, I do think that the impulse to do this does come from not only, you know, from our design team, but it is aided by the industry starting to push for it more. So we can talk a little bit about that later. There are many different ways, you know, lots of, we need momentum, and so the energy for that momentum comes from different places.
Great. Okay, now that we've talked about embodied carbon for a while, let's shift gears a little bit and dig into the operational carbon side. We know energy is obviously a key piece of this puzzle, and we've talked about product manufacturing impacts. But let's talk about when the buildings are operating. Isaiah, can you share a little bit about what you're seeing in efficiency and facility management?
Yes. Obviously, commissioning is key, right? We want to make sure that the building is operating as designed. So that is paramount. And then we also, right, need to have those sub-meters so we can understand where that energy loss is occurring. because with operational, a lot of our emissions are coming from heating, cooling, and lighting our spaces. So when you have sub-meters on all of your equipment, it's easier to adjust. And as you design more efficient buildings, small little tweaks can have major impacts. For example, CoLab, even though we've been occupied through COVID, we are seeing we're about 5% under our modeled energy consumption since May. So we actually are showing that net zero energy, which is great. But we had to tweak the system a little bit, and that was changing set points, a degree, and then also managing plug loads for off hours. So simple little items can be adjusted as long as they're being tracked.
Great. And Jeff, can you share a little bit, what are you seeing as it relates to energy?
Yeah, I think on our side, we're seeing, a pretty broad spectrum. By and large, I would say a predominant portion of our clients are making some significant investments into their carbon footprints and how to address those. We're seeing heavy investments in both regional grids, so places where the projects are located in order to be able to offset those operational emissions. We're also seeing a different approach where they're looking for the dirty grids to be able to invest in, right? It makes more sense to offset heavy coal areas rather than Central California areas, as an example, or Pacific Northwest areas. So we're seeing some of those shifts taking place and prioritizing how they're having those strategies impacted. We're also seeing a significant push, and probably I would say over the last year and a half, towards electrification. Electrification of projects, getting rid of gas, moving away from gas installed on the project, and that's having a pretty significant impact as well. And what's great is we're seeing large-scale projects all over the world that are able to make that happen, even huge tower headquarter projects that are able to make that happen. So we know it's possible, which is fantastic.
Great. I know we had mentioned a little before when we were talking about kind of some of the code impacts, even driving some of these decisions. Holly, can you share a little bit about what you're seeing for codes and kind of some of the jurisdictional, information we've received?
Yeah, I think of code, especially on the energy conservation code, they're sort of the unsung heroes of this process, because absolutely over every code cycle, we're just seeing more requirements towards energy efficiency. So that's one of the key drivers. For those in this region, I mean, one of the ways each jurisdiction has different levers it can pull. And so I just selected Arlington, DC and Montgomery County because that's where we do most of our work. And in Arlington, for example, you see a policy, and in that policy, additional developable area, FAR, is granted on top of what you can get by permit. And so there's this mechanism for getting some of these high performance buildings and then giving something in return, and there's a matrix of options. Developers can choose how they want to utilize this, and they actually have their own sort of EUI calculator. That's a measure of what type of energy, so you can put your building in and figure out where you're going to be, which I think is really helpful tool. They do mention carbon as a metric. For some reason, I think it's interesting. Are we just talking about energy, or are we talking about, is carbon the word used? And I would say, even 6 months ago, carbon was not in my lexicon the way it is today. I almost always talk about it now. In terms of DC, very, very ambitious climate goals, the Clean Energy Act of 2018, and within that is the Building Energy Performance Standard. So basically, DC is saying, if you're a building of a certain size, most buildings are going to fit into these categories. You have to Energy Star benchmark, and then we're going to compare you to your peers. And so they're going to essentially increase, turn the screws, and people are going to have to get more and more efficient. Interestingly enough, within that legislation, they can at some point, rather than talk about energy efficiency, talk about greenhouse gas benchmarking. So they're already thinking they wanted the ability to transfer to carbon as the way they're determining that you're meeting their laws. It's a law. And then in Montgomery County, they had just recently renewed their property tax credit law. And so most of these jurisdictions have been working on this sort of thing for years. In Montgomery County, it's been associated with the tax credit, and they've been doing it, I think, since 2006. And so the developers understand that process. And there's really, you should go to the website, all these websites actually, there's really good information there. They do use Energy Star as the benchmarking tool, so energy-based, and they have a climate action plan too. So, and I'm just going to put in a shameless plug for the Net Zero Energy Coalition, which is a group of us in this area, designers, government people, engineers, builders, sharing information. And so I think one of the things is that all of us want to compete and get that project. Once someone wins the project, you want to hope that they get as far as they can with each of these projects. We all have to be doing all that we can. And this coalition is put together in order to share lessons learned. As a group, we have a lot to do. So.
Okay, great. I wanted to talk a little bit about, since we've talked about embodied, we talked about operational, we touched on the supply chain. Now looking kind of at the product level, we've seen a lot of large end users establish carbon neutral goals and really come out there and push the market forward. How are the product manufacturers affording these offsets? I've heard about a carbon tax, but I don't understand exactly what that means. If you could share a little bit more about what that approach is, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think it's so at the product level, again, because of all of this attention to embodied carbon and wanting to reduce those levels, manufacturers are starting to think about how they can offer carbon neutral products. And in doing so, they also want to be able to do that without increasing the cost for the end user, right? This isn't about taking the impacts that I've created and passing that buck to somebody else. It's taking responsibility for that buck, right? And so manufacturers are, by and large, looking at that as a tax. These are the costs of carbon for us to create these products and for us to offset and offer a carbon neutral product. You're seeing that with Interface, who's been doing that for years now, offsetting their entire embodied carbon emissions for their products year over year. And now they're starting to, what you're starting to see is as they now innovate their products to reduce the embodied carbon impacts, like their new product that just came out that's actually a carbon negative backing material, that reduces their tax, right? Now all of a sudden they don't have to offset as much for the next year as they start to convert to those new products. We're also seeing it on the owner side. Fairly large Fortune 500 companies and some others are starting to look at the carbon tax as an interdepartmental tax that they leverage within the organization. If you're working in the real estate department, you're responsible for your carbon tax, and ultimately there's a cost associated with that. That starts to incentivize the reductions and make that a little easier driver. A little easier to convince people to start making some of those changes, especially since the parent company has said we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030 and carbon positive by 2050. That's a big statement to have to make. And so it's really important to start to put mechanisms in place that will drive change.
And then Holly, do you have anything you want to add from a developer's perspective, just given your work with that group?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking in a different way, but somewhat similarly, this idea of a tax and how people work with it. At a recent ULI presentation, Oxford Properties, international developer, active here in DC as well, along with MetLife, who has, real estate is it's an asset that they manage. Both of them have large portfolios that they're taking to net zero carbon. And so for me, when I spoke earlier about what are the drivers, and this is the other end of the spectrum from the product, right? This is the people that are actually commissioning these buildings and these developments. And if they're that committed, we're then seeing that message come, sort of down the chain and into our world a little bit more. And there's another category category that we are also seeing, and again, common in DC, probably common in all major metropolitan areas, associations that have a mission around climate change. And so National Geographic is one of our clients, and they have been tracking their greenhouse gas, their carbon footprints. I got a report from them from 2009. So you know, climate change isn't new. We've known for decades that it's happening, and there are these organizations that have been doing it and doing it well in terms of trying to stay on top of it. And then again, we were talking about products. You know, I do find it heartening when I'm talking to a developer about something like a carbon mix, and come to find out they're ahead of me. They know more than I do because they've been, you know, trying to figure this out as well. I mean, I think in my world, I'm always looking for the win-win-win when something doesn't cost more, but has, you know, a great narrative around sustainability, but also functions, you know, really well. So some of these products, that's true. And so I think we need to champion, you know, sort of having that mindset, looking for those win-win-wins.
We are actually getting some questions from the audience. So I'm going to share some of those with you now. So one question is, while we're on the topic of tax, how large are these taxes typically? And is it always going to be something to be aware of in product costing?
What I would say is that's going to vary depending on the manufacturer. I would say most manufacturers who are putting out carbon neutral products are taking on the cost of that tax themselves, very similar to Interface. They're not, it's not reaching the bottom line. You're not seeing an increase in the cost associated with that. And I think a lot of manufacturers are starting to recognize that they can't, you know, this can't be a cost increase to the client. They have to be able to manage this cost internally. I'm sorry, Megan, I just forgot what the last part of the statement was.
It was just asking, you know, is this something always that we're going to have to be aware of when we're looking at product costing? Which,
yeah, I mean, if they are offering a carbon neutral product, you know, make sure to ask that it's not kind of, you know, building a cost burden to the project. But most of the time, we're seeing that that's not been the case.
Another question that just came in was about how going for net zero energy really plays into the tenant-landlord relationships. So Holly, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Sure, it's definitely an aspect of taking an entire building to net zero energy, and so there are things that have to be considered, such as a lease. And at American Geophysical Union, which we are working on, they did, in fact, they have a tenant in there, and the tenant essentially had to agree to similar systems and to sort of a level of energy use commitment. So it does take the building as a whole into consideration. And then, of course, you know, there are other versions of this in which it's just one tenant space, which is net zero energy. So yeah, you have to think about it, no question.
There's also, I mean, that's actually a really critical part of achieving that when you have individual tenants.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've been experimenting with a company called Giga, they have a reset technology where they're looking at air quality, measuring materials, basically putting sensors in your tenant spaces, and then in kind of a blind way, allowing a competition to take place, right? Where each tenant is now evaluated against another tenant based on their energy use, their air quality, all of these things. And what we can start to see is that it starts to become a direct way to drive engagement, because the people who are low performing on those lists often want to know, what are those other people doing, and why is it that I can, what can I do to reduce my load on this? There's also talk about shifting these costs, right? Landlords are starting to think, well, wait a minute, it's not my fault that all of these things are happening. I'm going to pass these costs on to tenants. And that's becoming more and more of a conversation about how, you know, what the mechanism is to do that. And so the more that we can leverage these tools to engage those tenants to be a participant in this exercise and actually be interested in making updates and improvements in their spaces, the sooner that we're going to have success in seeing these zero energy solutions for buildings.
Yeah, we just one last, we do often talk about the impact of the individuals in these spaces, and you're right, Jeff, that's part of the equation, is making sure, and data is essential part of that, being able to externalize information to tenants.
Yeah, it's amazing the power that can come from a few sensors.
Yeah.
So, are there certain building sectors that are leading the way in this that you've seen?
I would say a lot of them have made public commitments, right? You're seeing a lot of Fortune 500 groups, the Amazons, the Microsofts, the Salesforces, the LinkedIn's, the Googles, all of them are making fairly lofty commitments to these. I think they're laying the groundwork and making it a little easier for the next round of early adopters to start to make those commitments as well. But yeah, it takes a group to really kind of start kicking down those barriers and expanding the conversation. So yeah, I would say that they're leading the way right now.
I think the question may also have had to do with building type, because that's, am I right about that? So one of the tricky things is in our region, certainly the bright stars are the elementary schools. So there are building typologies that are long and low and are educational, which is again an additional win when you're educating people about net zero energy. And then there's the complexity of many story office buildings and how you get those to net zero energy. And typically, because I can't help myself, I have to be honest, you are going to end up buying offsets for larger buildings that have a limited footprint. And then, things like data centers, right? So there are typologies that are more challenging than others. Go ahead.
And it's possible though, right? I'm glad to say that we do work with clients that are able to make net zero facilities that are data centers, and others. So it's possible out there. It's certainly not going to be affordable for everyone. The mechanisms may not be in place for everyone to be able to do it, but there is significant groundbreaking being done at all of these levels. And I would say that from an embodied carbon perspective, from a project type, every project should be on the table, right? I think even Holly would say that it's, every project that we talk about has an opportunity to reduce the carbon footprint 40 to 50% just by talking about a couple items.
And it's why too, why a portfolio, it's interesting to consider, because many of these large companies have a very, very diverse portfolios, and they're saying across the entire portfolio they're going to do it. So they're taking the challenge of the difficult ones along with the easier ones.
Yeah, there's actually a second part to this question asking about net zero energy and multifamily in particular, and if you're seeing any trends in that space.
Yeah, well, that's another one in which you have, we have a couple of local projects in particular that are using Passive House and are trying to get to net zero energy. And there is that complexity of a lot of tenants, right? So you have, many people living in one building that you're trying to get to treat their energy use very with care. And again, I think the emphasis that I've seen is more on let's get the building to be as efficient as possible. And there's a lot of work to be done on that end. So it's more on the energy, the sort of modeling of the building end so far. But Jeff, you may know more in terms of your clients.
Yeah, I would just say that, the multifamily tends to be, I guess, where I would expect them to be. We all are just kind of, maybe waking up to this new reality and understanding the tools and resources that are there and starting to try and figure out how to back up some of our commitments and make stronger commitments overall. And so they're all, at this particular point, what we're seeing is, they want to measure. I can't start making reductions until I know what it is that I'm starting to reduce against. And so we're seeing a lot of outpouring of whole building LCAs and EC3 exercises to try and better understand what those footprints are. Because there's a lot of information that's still ready to be unpacked with that.
The other thing I would just add quickly is that New York City's, the lever that they are pulling has to do with carbon and greenhouse gases. And so they're multifamily housing developers, just anecdotally, one of the architecture firms that I was on a panel on says that almost all of their developers are choosing Passive House, which is this very efficient system, because they know that that's the long-term right choice for them because of what the law is. And what I found fascinating is they'll do these stacks where they'll do a Passive House stack of residential along with an office building. So people are getting very creative, and I do think that the push on the policy side is turning out to be a very effective way to encourage people to start to do these things until it becomes the norm.
Isaiah, I have a question for you that came in. What is the potential outcome if nothing is done in regards to carbon reduction?
Well, as we mentioned in the beginning of this session, it's pretty dire and catastrophic. There are going to be significant life changes for everybody. We hit that 2-degree threshold. I mean, we're already seeing changes now in the environment. We don't have to hit that 2-degree threshold, but if we hit that 2-degree threshold, then other environmental greenhouse gases will begin to emit even higher. It's going to exponentially grow. The more melting of tundras is going to emit more methane gas, increasing, that temperature is just going to keep rising exponentially. I really suggest everybody log in to UN Global Compact. These guys are leading the way and, predicting what's going to happen. So it's not coming from me, it's coming from more, educated scientists, but it is pretty catastrophic. So I don't think that's an option. And luckily, we're seeing clients commit, right? Architectural firms, beyond just jurisdictional requirements. So I think there's a lot of big players that are already bought in and can sway that needle. Now it's just on all of us to make it happen.
Yeah, and I will add that Architecture 2030 is a good resource for this. Ed Mesria has been responsible for a lot of the change in policy efforts that have happened globally around these issues. And the one thing I'll point out is IPCC report done a few years ago warned of what a 2-degree planet would look like. And it's dire. It is not a pretty place. If you read the report, it is not a pretty place. And what we need to get back to is back to a 1.5 degree limit on what we're putting, because nobody wants to live in a 2.0 planet. So I think you're going to see a big push even this year from policymakers globally to try and get that number back down to 1.5 and make our commitments, our 2030 commitments around that new 1.5 number.
And I think just within the last hour or so, there was a press release about Bezos committing $400 million to some of these organizations that are trying to push back on climate change. So clearly, a lot of people are taking it very seriously.
So we're getting ready to wrap up. I'll give a minute in case anyone in the audience has additional questions to ask. But while we're waiting for that, on a more positive side, what are you most excited about that you see kind of coming down the pike? Like, what is getting you really excited and passionate about, really conquering this topic?
I'm glad to go first.
Go for it.
Yeah, so a year ago I went to the National Renewable Energy Lab to review grants. That they provide grants for materials research, and it still makes me happy thinking that there are a lot of people all around our country literally trying to sort this out in a way that will affect the built environment. And so I don't know exactly what will be coming out of that research, but I know that it's multifaceted and will affect how we affect the environment. And then the other thing I will say is just last week hearing that there are these developers and owners that are saying we're gonna take on the challenge of net zero carbon unilaterally, which is just amazing.
Yeah, I think the exciting part for me is that there's a lot of materials that are not included in what we report for our whole building LCAs and our understanding of embodied carbon. So there's a lot of research that's being done in that space. From a scope 3 perspective right now, the only way that companies can report their real estate investments is through cost. And so cost is not a good driver for reductions, right? Because it still costs money to buy a carbon neutral product, even if it reduces that carbon impact. So we're submitting, at the end of November, we're submitting a sector supplement to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to basically put in a new methodology for being able to tabulate embodied carbon as a scope 3 and a reportable scope 3 emissions, and to be able to use EPDs and EC3 data and all of this kind of new uncertainty information in order to make the accounting of this from a carbon perspective more viable and easier for them to show improvements on. That will be an amazing process, and we've started a total carbon coalition, a group of owners who are interested in understanding and unpacking the embodied carbon of all of the other materials that are in our buildings. Think of all the MEP systems, the IT systems, all of the extra stuff that goes into our projects that is not currently being measured or reported or doesn't have EPD data. We're on a 4-year grind to get that information so that by 2025 we can plug in numbers and know exactly what those carbon emissions are, and we can demonstrate reductions and report those as scope 3. So that's the mission that we're on as at Brightworks.
Yeah, I'm excited to see basically what both of you just touched base on. It's snowballing, right? It's coming from multiple directions, right? We have local jurisdictions, C40 groups declaring, right, that they want their cities to be net zero. We have, industry leading developers and clients declaring goals that seem almost unachievable right now. And then we have manufacturers jumping on board to truly understand their impacts of their materials. So all of that and all the data points that we can gather now, right? The more sub-meters, the more information we have, I think that will help drive and exponentially expedite this process of reaching that zero carbon goal.
I'm going to throw one other thing in, which is about all of this, and that's partnerships. I think you're seeing a lot of people work together to figure this out. So.
Very much so.
Great. Well, I think that is all of the Q&A that we had, and I just want to say thank you so much to Isaiah and Holly and Jeff for sharing your expertise and teaching us the way. To everybody tuning in, we have the presentation for you as well as the recorded session, and we'll share contact information in case you have any additional questions that you would like to chat with our esteemed panel on. So thanks so much to everybody for joining in.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks, Holly. Thanks, Isaiah.
Yeah,
Really appreciate it.
Terrific.
Yep.